There is a very specific guttural roar that a heavy-duty diesel engine makes when it is suddenly and violently breathing straight out of the manifolds. It's not just loud. It's a concussive, chest-rattling shockwave that vibrates the fillings right out of your teeth. At 2:45 in the morning on a dreary Tuesday, that exact sound violated the silence of my usually quiet neighborhood. I had turned the ignition key on my rig, expecting the familiar muffled rumble of my daily driver. Instead, I woke up 3 blocks of sleeping residents. My coffee spilled across the center console as the cab shook like a paint mixer. It took exactly 3 seconds for my groggy brain to register what had happened. I killed the engine, the sudden silence ringing in my ears, and stepped out into the damp night air. Dropping to my knees, I shined my phone's flashlight under the chassis. Sure enough, there was a jagged, empty void where my catalytic converters used to be. The exhaust pipes dangled like severed arteries, the metal edges shining brightly under the harsh LED light, clearly freshly chewed through by a reciprocating saw. I knelt there on the cold asphalt, smelling the sharp tang of unburnt diesel fumes, and a slow, involuntary grin spread across my face. You see, if you're going to crawl under a 3-ton truck in the dead of night to steal emissions equipment for a quick payday, you really ought to do a little research first. If these midnight mechanics had bothered to tap on the metal housing, they would have noticed the hollow, echoing ring. I had gutted those converters months ago to let the engine breathe better. They hadn't stolen hundreds of dollars worth of precious rhodium and palladium. They had stolen 2 worthless, empty tin cans. It wasn't so funny, however, that I now had to weld in straight pipes and apologize to my neighbors. The humor faded, replaced by a cold, calculated irritation. I wanted payback, and I knew exactly how to get it. The idiots had completely missed the fact that my next-door neighbor, an insomniac retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Gable, had recently installed a perimeter security system that rivaled a military black site. By 7 a.m., I was sitting at Mrs. Gable's dining table, sipping weak tea and watching crisp, 1080p infrared footage of the crime. The video showed a battered Ford Crown Victoria rolling to a stop in front of my driveway. Even in the monochrome night vision, the car looked like a rolling tetanus hazard. It was an old police interceptor, still bearing the faded, ghostly outlines of municipal decals on its doors. The suspension sagged heavily to the left, and the front bumper was held together by what looked like industrial zip ties. 2 scrawny figures piled out. I recognized them instantly. They were local fixtures, a pair of neighborhood menaces named Braxton and Taggart. They spent most of their waking hours loitering around the grease-stained parking lot of a local fried chicken shack, smoking cheap cigarettes and vibrating the windows of nearby storefronts with a trunk-mounted subwoofer that sounded like a washing machine full of bowling balls. I watched the screen as Taggart shimmied under my truck with a battery-powered saw, while Braxton stood lookout, nervously tapping a crowbar against his leg. 7 minutes later, they tossed my useless, hollowed-out exhaust parts into the trunk and sped off, their brake lights completely dark. I thanked Mrs. Gable, walked back to my house, and picked up my phone. I could have called the police right then, handed over the footage, and had them arrested for petty theft and vandalism. But where is the poetry in that? A slap on the wrist, a night in holding, and they'd be back on the street by Thursday. No, I needed something far more permanent, something that would hurt them right in their perceived center of gravity. I scrolled through my contacts and dialed Darnell Higgins. Darnell worked for the city's Code Enforcement Division, a man whose encyclopedic knowledge of municipal nuisance laws was matched only by his absolute disdain for abandoned and illegal vehicles. I explained my morning, the hollowed-out converters, the security footage, and most importantly, the condition of the Crown Victoria. "Darnell," I said, leaning against my kitchen counter, "this interceptor has no license plates. I know for a fact it has no insurance. The tail lights are dead and it rattles like a tin roof in a hurricane. It's a rolling code violation. If I happen to spot it parked on a public street, what are the odds we can classify it as a public nuisance and authorize a tow?" Darnell chuckled, a low, rumbling sound over the receiver. "You find it on a public right-of-way without tags, you call me. I'll relay it to dispatch, and the local precinct will gladly give you the green light to scrape that blight off the asphalt. Consider it a community service." For the next 3 days, I drove my backup vehicle, a flatbed wrecker I used for my actual towing business, with the vigilance of a hawk hunting field mice. I knew their habits. I knew they practically lived at that chicken shack, surviving on stolen exhaust money and greasy dark meat. It didn't take long. On Thursday afternoon, I spotted the Crown Victoria. It was parked half on the sidewalk, half on a quiet residential side street 2 blocks from the poultry joint. I pulled my flatbed around the corner, killed the engine, and took a walk around the vehicle. Up close, it was even worse than the cameras had shown. The tires were completely bald, the clear coat was peeling off in sheets like dead skin, and the interior smelled strongly of stale beer and cheap vanilla air fresheners. There was no license plate, just a faded, illegible piece of cardboard taped to the rear window. The driver's side door lock cylinder was completely caved in, gouged out by screwdrivers over the years. You could probably start the ignition with a popsicle stick. I pulled out my phone, snapped 3 photos of the violations, and sent them to Darnell. 10 minutes later, my radio crackled. Dispatch had received the nuisance complaint and authorized the impound. I backed the flatbed up to the Crown Vic's crumbling front bumper. Working with practiced efficiency, I looped the J-hooks around the lower control arms, engaged the PTO, and let the hydraulic winch do its work. The interceptor groaned and squeaked in protest as it was dragged up the steep steel incline of the bed. I strapped the wheels down tight, climbed into my cab, and drove away. The entire operation took less than 6 minutes. Braxton and Taggart were probably still waiting on their fries. Instead of taking the car to my own impound lot, I drove it straight to the rear staging area of the local police precinct. Darnell was waiting there alongside a desk sergeant named Miller, a man who looked perpetually exhausted by the sheer volume of neighborhood stupidity he dealt with daily. "All right, let's see who actually owns this masterpiece," Sergeant Miller sighed, pulling out a ruggedized tablet. He walked over to the flatbed, wiped a layer of grime off the dashboard, and scanned the VIN through the windshield. We stood in silence for a few moments as the municipal database chewed on the numbers. Miller frowned, tapping the screen. "Well, this is a mess. This VIN hasn't had an active registration since 2011. And the last registered owner is a guy who currently resides in a state penitentiary 3 counties over. These kids bought a ghost car. Whoever sold it to them never had the title, probably because it has over a decade of backcode registration fees and penalties attached to it. It's not street legal, it's not insured, and legally it doesn't belong to the 2 geniuses who have been driving it." "So, what's the protocol?" I asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear him say it. "Without a legal owner to claim it, and given its condition, it's categorized as a derelict hazard," Miller replied, clicking a pen and signing a bright yellow form. "Take it to the scrapyard. We'll issue a black title for it, a certificate of destruction. It's going to be crushed." I took the yellow paperwork, fighting to keep a neutral expression. "Understood, Sergeant. I know just the place." I drove across town to the industrial district, pulling through the rusted chain-link gates of a salvage yard owned by Olin Farrow. Olin was a man who seemed to be constructed entirely of leather, motor oil, and cigarette ash. He had run the junkyard for 30 years and had a deep, abiding hatred for the local meth heads and petty thieves who constantly tried to scale his fences to steal copper wire. I unloaded the Crown Vic onto a patch of dirt near the main crusher. I handed Olin the certificate of destruction and gave him a brief rundown of the situation, including the identities of the car's previous occupants. Olin leaned against the fender of the impounded car, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Braxton and Taggart, huh? Those 2 little ferrets tried to sell me 3 stolen catalytic converters just yesterday. Looked like they were off a heavy diesel. I told him to take a hike because I don't buy black market cats, especially hollowed-out ones. They looked pretty disappointed. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Yeah, those were mine. That's why this car is sitting here." Olin's eyes lit up with a mischievous glint. "Well now, that changes things. You know, these boys ain't exactly bright. If they realize the car is missing, they're going to wander around town thinking one of their equally brain-dead friends stole it as a prank. Eventually they'll track it down here. The ignition is completely hollowed out. A stiff breeze could start this engine. They might just try to hop the fence and drive it right out the front gate." "That would be a shame," I said dryly. "A real tragedy," Olin agreed. He dropped the greasy rag, walked over to his tool shed, and wheeled out an acetylene torch. "Tell you what, just in case they get any bright ideas, I'm going to make sure this vehicle remains stationary." I watched as Olin slid underneath the rear of the Crown Victoria on a creeper. A moment later, the blinding blue-white flame of the torch sparked to life. Sparks showered onto the dirt. I heard the distinct, heavy clunk of solid metal hitting the ground. Olin slid out, turning off the torch, and pointed to the severed steel cylinder resting in the dirt. He had completely cut the driveshaft in half. The engine could run, the transmission could shift, but the rear wheels were never going to turn again. I had to get back to work, so I missed the grand finale, but Olin called me later that evening to give me the play-by-play. Just as we predicted, Braxton and Taggart had spent the entire afternoon running frantically around town, accusing their friends of grand theft auto. Eventually, word reached them that a flatbed had been seen hauling their beloved, rattling interceptor toward the industrial park. Around twilight, they showed up at the junkyard. According to Olin, Braxton walked into the front office, loudly asking about scrap prices for aluminum siding in a transparent attempt to distract him. Meanwhile, Taggart slinked around the side of the building, hopped a low section of the fence, and sprinted toward the Crown Victoria. Olin, watching the security monitors under his desk, simply dialed the local precinct. Sergeant Miller, who was already familiar with the car, dispatched 2 cruisers immediately. Out in the yard, Taggart slid into the driver's seat. He jammed a flathead screwdriver into the ruined ignition and cranked it. The engine sputtered, coughed, and roared to life. He slammed the column shifter into drive, stomped on the gas pedal, and braced himself for the getaway. Instead of peeling out in a blaze of glory, the engine redlined with a deafening scream. Underneath the car, the severed front half of the driveshaft spun wildly, clanging and violently thrashing against the floorboards like a jackhammer. The car didn't move an inch. Taggart panicked, shifting into reverse, then back to drive, only making the metallic thrashing louder and more catastrophic. He was still sitting there, revving the engine and wondering why the laws of physics had abandoned him, when the red and blue lights of the police cruisers swept across the junkyard. Braxton tried to run out the front door, but ran face first into the chest of a very unamused patrol officer. They were arrested on the spot for trespassing and attempted grand theft, but the police didn't haul them away immediately. The officers made them stand there, handcuffed against the hood of a cruiser, while Olin fired up the junkyard's mobile crane. Olin told me it was the highlight of his month. He maneuvered the massive hydraulic pincer over the Crown Victoria. With the slow, agonizing crunch of shattering glass and buckling steel, the claw clamped down on the roof. The 2 thieves watched in absolute silence as the crane lifted their precious, bass-rattling interceptor into the air, swung it over to the scrap pile, and ripped it to absolute shreds. When I visited the yard a few days later, the remains of the car looked like a toddler had gotten angry at a toy block and ripped it down to its bare, twisted frame out of pure, destructive curiosity. Braxton and Taggart spent a few nights in county lockup before making bail. They've been out for a week now, but they haven't been seen at the chicken shack. In fact, they haven't left the confines of the Whispering Pines trailer park where they live. I know this because my towing routes frequently take me past that exact park. I did a slow drive-by earlier this afternoon. Sitting in their weed-choked driveway, baking in the midday sun, was a severely battered Jeep Liberty. The suspension was shot, the windows were tinted with cheap, bubbling film, and wouldn't you know it, there were absolutely no license plates bolted to the bumpers. I smiled, tapping my fingers against my steering wheel. I already have Darnell's number queued up in my phone. I'm already working with code enforcement to document the vehicle. The moment those 2 idiots feel confident enough to roll that uninsured, unregistered death trap onto a public street, my flatbed will be waiting. And this time I'm making sure I don't miss the show. Sometimes the universe doesn't balance the scales on its own. Sometimes karma needs a little push, or in this case a hydraulic winch and an acetylene torch. If you're going to steal from people, you'd better make sure your own house, or your own ride, is completely in order. Because you never know when the person you wronged knows exactly how to use the rulebook to completely dismantle your life. If you enjoyed this story of mechanical revenge, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and let me know, what's the most creative way you've ever seen someone get back at a thief? Keep your vehicles locked, register your cars, and I'll see you in the next one.